Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I also wanted to remind folks that, of course, Expanding Mind has a pretty big archive at this point. You can call in to PRN at 1-701-719-0890 to listen to some recent episodes through your phone, or of course you can subscribe to it the way that everybody subscribes to podcasts. And I have an archive as well on my own website, techgnosis.com, techgnosis.com. All right, enough of the razzmatazz. On to the show. I started out, I was always interested in new technologies, starting around the late 1980s. I was reading books about future of computers, about algorithms, about the history of technology. But I always kind of took it from a humanities point of view, and I always took it as a sort of point of pride that I knew a lot more about science and technology, and really could have been a technologist, a mathematician, a computer programmer, but got seduced by the humanities and cultural criticism and writing, and that's sort of what I ended up doing. But it gave me a taste for a certain kind of what you could call technology criticism, a certain way of approaching particularly the gadgets in our lives that link us to these much larger, more challenging to imagine and understand networks and institutions and flows of data and money and ideology. And as I rode the technology wave in my own peculiar quasi-mystical way, I found that kind of criticism was harder and harder to find. That much of what constituted technology criticism tended to be either sort of obsessively in the fold, people who knew their technical details, who were able to describe or understand the particular issues involved, but also often got kind of myopically involved with the possibilities and the politics and the business around those things in ways that made it harder for people who are interested in a broader view or a humanities kind of view to integrate it. And at the same time, you have people in the sort of humanities side of the fence, cultural writers, historians, people interested in politics, in the future, in the problems of capitalism, sort of misunderstanding technology a lot of the time and kind of reading it either, finding utopia where they should have been suspicious and being very pessimistic about things that actually had some potential for good. And so I'm incredibly happy to say that this trend that I've noticed over the last couple of decades, and of course there's tons of exceptions, but one of my favorite books that I've read recently really bucks the trend. This is Radical Technologies by Adam Greenfield, a name that I had heard, but I hadn't actually stumbled across his work directly other than a few articles in The Guardian. He's an urbanist and technologist, a designer, and still a very smart humanities fellow with a strong grounding in politics in a real deal way that, again, I find rare among people who know their technology inside and out. And he's probably best known for earlier and increasingly cranky remarks he's made about the smart city and the sort of utopian vision of a kind of integrated information flowing, the responsive experience of the urban landscape. And so he's brought some very sophisticated critiques of that vision to into the conversation about smart cities and the Internet of Things. And Radical Technologies takes an even broader approach. I would classify it as required reading. I don't often say that, though I often enjoy the books that we're talking about here on Expanding Mind. This is one that's a little bit more like, it's more meat and potatoes, folks. And part of Adam's point, and he makes it very strongly at the end of this book, which covers a wide variety of radical technologies, meaning the technologies that are already here or just around the horizon that threaten to transform things in really drastic and dramatic ways that nobody can really understand. And there's the possibility that within that radicalism, there's really positive things that might come of it. And indeed, some people on the left, some progressive folks have really embraced certain of these technologies as potential ameliorations of the monster capitalism that we're in. But the real question is just, what's going to happen? How are we going to integrate these things? Is it even possible to think about integrating them? And so in order to really go into this, you got to spend some time getting a better handle than the newspapers give you about what's going on in the technologies. And by that, I even mean some of the information press, like, whatever, Wired News or whatever. You can learn stuff from those things, but you got to do like another layer of sometimes tedious work in order to really understand the way that these sort of seemingly innocuous gadgets that we actually interact with on a daily level tie into these much larger frameworks and networks of concern, of politics, of ecology, of economy. And so Adam does an amazing job of synthesizing information and tons of research about technologies like augmented reality, like cryptocurrencies, like the blockchain, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, and really giving you a dense, rich understanding of some of the dynamics behind the surface of these technologies, and at the same time offering very cogent critiques from a progressive perspective that's also very culturally nuanced. And that's the part that really sets him apart from a lot of writers and even critics of these developments, is that his sensibility is one, at least personally, I find incredibly appealing, a kind of humor, a kind of wit, a kind of willingness to look at the grim meat hook reality that's being installed before our eyes, but kind of drawing you into it. So I really encourage folks to check out this book more than most things that I talk about on the show, because as Adam points out at the very end, if we are going to engage these issues as progressives or just as people trying to keep our shit together, we have to understand them a little better than we do now, partly to be able to recognize hype, partly to be able to anticipate things that are going to happen based on the history of technology, a more fine-grained history than we usually have, because most of us aren't actually encouraged to learn very much about technology or to think about it critically, either by the people who are selling us the stuff or by our own tendencies to just want to get through our lives or to do the things we want to do with our friends, and et cetera, unless we're actually making our living off of it. And even then, we're mostly just looking at the very narrow zone that we're working with, and often within the kind of corporate context that these technologies are taken up with. So it requires a different kind of investment to bring technology criticism into your own mind and into your own life as a way of kind of at least being aware of these processes that are going on, of course, most of them outside of our immediate control. So enough smoke has been blown for the intro. Adam, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Hey, Erik, it's my pleasure. I mean, I've been reading you probably a quarter century now, so it's a real honor and a privilege.
Well, it's I just really love this book, and I've been telling people about it a lot. And I want to dive into it. We only got an hour. There's tons of stuff to talk about. But before that, I have to ask you a biographical question, which is looking at the Wikipedia page. I'm like, what impelled you in 1995 to enlist in the United States Army Special Operations Command as a psychological operations specialist? It doesn't seem to jive with either your previous life studying cultural studies or your future life as a designer working for Nokia and writing these kind of technology criticism books.
There's two ways of answering that question, and they're both honest, right? They're both real. The first is the sort of material explanation is that I was recently broke, divorced, living in Seattle, a city that I couldn't wait to get out of, frankly. No offense to anybody who might happen to be listening in Seattle. And honestly, so broke that enlisting in the Army at that point was the surest ticket out of there, and the most reliable path towards some kind of guaranteed income over the short term, because I had at that point made myself pretty decisively unemployable. The other way of answering that is that for all that I was aware of it, doesn't mean that I was completely immune to the ambient masculinist nonsense that circulates in our culture. And you, of all people, probably be aware of how the Army had, certainly in my youth, had recuperated the language of the human potential movement. You know, some of the Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon stuff about be all you can be. And so I thought, you know, I was sort of a student of lived experiences. And I thought, well, you know, after you've pushed yourself into exploring silent meditation and Zen practice, after you pushed yourself into triathlon, after you pushed yourself into some experiences that we might think of as being along the BDSM spectrum, you know, what other extreme things can you do for yourself? And one of the extreme things that it turned out I could do for myself in the mid-'90s in Seattle, Washington, was enlist first in the reserve, and then get myself kicked up to a special operations unit, and try that on for size.
Well, I think that's pretty good explanation. It actually makes sense more, particularly from that kind of limited experience point of view. And there also seems to be something, I can only imagine that you got some really good stuff out of being working in psychological operations, because one of the things that I like about your approach and that I think is so important is that when people write about technology from a critical point of view, let's see, they're you know, whether they're leftists or they're defending life ways that are being, you know, blanketed by new technologies, they often fall into a kind of abstraction where you start talking about the larger forces that are involved, and how these sort of large abstractions are eroding or colonizing our felt sense of everyday reality. But the people who are talking about it also kind of get into that abstraction, whereas what you continually do throughout the book is sort of bring it back home in these moments to exactly what happens when the human psyche meets these sometimes unthinkable abstractions, and the way we react and how those experiences themselves are being changed and subtly and sometimes not so subtly altered by changing technological conditions. So there's a kind of attention to psychology and experience there that is really striking in a way. I mean, the just how much is happening at the level of our immediate experience, the flows of emotion, the way in which our attention is being modulated and changed, how our desire or fear is being mobilized in the system, all the subtle trade-offs that are happening on the edge of consciousness, almost like subconscious, you know, whatever, like the simple examples, like when it is in an argument that somebody reaches for the phone and Googles a question, how that has changed over the last 5 years, how the porosity of these things have shifted. And you can't really address that without paying attention to the psychology of the everyday, and how that sort of most familiar part of our lives is changing, being colonized, being reframed in all these ways, almost against our own acknowledgement. Like we almost don't even want to see how much that stuff is happening. So, I mean, where does your interest in that kind of psychological domain come from in terms of looking at these new technologies?
Well, you know, I'm really glad you pick up on that, because it may be the single most important thing I have to say in that book. It comes from just accepting what my senses have been trying to tell me, which is that, you know, the overwhelming experience, at least my overwhelming experience of what I like to think of as late capitalism, is one of anxiety and melancholy, the most profound melancholy. and a kind of a claustrophobia, a lack of the spaciousness that perhaps, we used to experience in life. And, I could say a couple of things. I could say, is this maybe my own experience and I'm overgeneralizing from my own particular experience? I could say, is this an artifact of the time of life that I'm in, that, this feels novel to me because I'm in a new phase of my existence and I wasn't feeling these things before because they weren't germane to me. And so I want to kind of control for those possibilities. And in asking around, in trying to evoke other people's experiences of these technologies, and very importantly to me, not merely people who are similar to me in terms of their class background or experiential background or national origin or any of that, but asking, most of the people that I encounter to kind of explain what their experience and try to bring to the surface what their affective experience of living in this technologically mediated age is. I find that actually this anxiety and this melancholy, they're not particular to me. They are, in fact, fairly widely shared. And what happens constantly to me is as I begin to, spin out one of these scenarios, people start to nod. And as a matter of fact, before I'm even finished with the sentence, they've got, 3 or 4 or 5 other examples that they're just kind of bursting to share, bursting to relate to somebody that might actually be able to understand what they're talking about. And to me, that's something that for all the power analysis, for all the analysis of power relations, that I think is a crucial part of any act of criticism, for all the attempt to evoke and bring to the surface the politics of emergent technologies and what I call the colonization of everyday life by information processing. To me, one of the most critical aspects is that we're kind of painting ourselves into a corner psycho-emotionally and affectively, and nobody really wants to talk about that. So, I have a little bit more room maybe in publishing with Verso. I have a little bit more room in maybe writing in The Guardian than I might in some other contexts to begin to explore and unfold and try and figure out just what's going on in these spaces and maybe return some agency to people so that they can, in becoming aware that this is happening not just to themselves, but fairly commonly, fairly broadly, maybe we can do something about it together.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about that melancholy. I mean, there's one part of the book that really struck me where you were talking about the Internet of Things and you were laying out the problems, the political problems, the power problems, the way in which, we're really just by allowing networked objects into the space of our everyday, we're just acceding to just a whole other order of control immediately, but then also in terms of all the data that's being collected on us and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm following this critical argument, and then you kind of just take this little turn and you go, what is the dominant, affective quality of these technologies? It's sadness.
Yeah.
There's this sadness in the way in which things are changing, not just nostalgically. That's the thing. I think the error, I'll take it one step back. I mean, one thing I want to say is that you're born just a year after me. There does seem to be a generational quality as well, because we were shaped by an analog world.
Sure.
We remember not just the literal kind of space of possibility, but just the fact that spaces were unknown, that we were walking home from school, that no one could find us or whatever. So we have a certain kind of orientation that younger people just don't have, never had. And I think that, maybe gives us a little extra spin on the melancholy. But it's not just about nostalgia. That's the thing that I had to realize, is like that it's actually something about the way in which our psyches map themselves into these spaces, is that there's kind of a place of sadness that we have to kind of like acknowledge or work from or integrate. I mean, it's because it's the tendency is to go, oh my God, I'm sad, or I'm depressed. Oh, that's because I should be able to kind of ride with these changes, or exploit them for my own desires, or take advantage of the possibilities that are being opened up. And that's part of the framework of the way the internet works, is making your own little crappy life seem miserable and small because there's so much other stuff going on, blah, blah, blah. But learning how to work with those feelings, I mean, talking about them, of course, is one of the great things to do. But how do you feel how do you think our being aware of our emotions and working on that level of affect in our own experience can help us understand what's going on? It can not just be like a block or a bummer that takes away our energy. How can it become fuel?
Well, it's the first step towards solidarity for me. I mean, the very first thing is being able to name your condition. And then the step beyond that, which is not automatic and requires effort and requires sort of a certain kind of self-discipline, is understanding that you have a common circumstance with other people, and that is the ground of potential solidarity, and therefore potential corrective action. I grew up the son of a litigator, right? My dad does class action suits against big corporations, and the interesting thing about the way a class action is set up is that there's always an individual named plaintiff, and that plaintiff gets to stand as the avatar for a whole group of people. And the language, even when I was like 7 or 8 years old, the language around this really captivated me. It's that person's name on behalf of themselves and all others similarly situated. And, there's something in that language that has stayed with me throughout my entire life. What I'm hoping here is that in naming the affect that arises out of our exposure to, a constant mediation by smartphones and a constant mediation by wearable biometric devices and a constant mediation by smart home assistants, we understand that we're part of a class, that there are, in fact, others similarly situated to us, and that we represent a potential political vector, certainly a market vector, and potentially at least the ground of some kind of coordinated collective action. But, this is not an automatic process. It's not like the light bulb goes off above your head and you suddenly find yourself part of, a protest group marching down the street, demanding redress. There's admitting that this is going on. There's the tracing it back to its sources. There's understanding the political economic circumstance it arises within. There's asking what other kinds of possible futures could we inhabit if we were so inclined. And there's asking what sorts of collective and concerted action might be necessary to get us to those places.
Yeah. I that makes a lot of sense to me as a way of kind of massing these responses in a way that could lead to things that we're grasping for, but aren't entirely clear. It's a challenge with talking with you, because part of me wants to sit there and go through some of the chapters where you actually explain in understandable detail how technologies like the blockchain work. And I think that anybody thinking about the future has to have at least a kind of working knowledge of what these technologies are, because they're already important. They're going to be more important, and also there's so many claims that are being made about them. I mean, just to take the blockchain, when I first started to read about it as not a particular, that wasn't something I was particularly invested in understanding. There was all these claims about anonymity. Oh, it's this thing that allows anonymity. And of course, it's like, no, it doesn't actually. It's a distributed ledger that keeps record of all transactions. It can be used to do shady things, but it's not anonymous at all the way that people are presenting it. And so even from a point where I wasn't even very technologically sophisticated about this particular thing, it took me a lot longer and talking to a lot of people to get a handle on it, that even I could recognize that there was just this profound kind of confusion from the get-go about these projects, about that particular set of projects and technologies. Yep. But it also gets caught up with progressive desire as well. I mean, some people, anarchists, and even folks on the left have seen, maybe the blockchain is going to allow us to create the kinds of environments that we can outrun capitalism or outrun the state and allow something else to happen. So there's so much detail. We would take the next half an hour to kind of go through all this stuff. So I'm going to resist that to a certain degree. And try to stay a little bit more on a broader zone. Okay. But so where I would go from that one is more about the question of how, as we try to understand new technologies like the blockchain, like machine learning, whatever, we're sitting here, we're reading, we're doing our lives, we engage them with them maybe through our business to some degree. How do we begin to understand the role that belief, that
Yes.
fantasy, that hype play in how the stories of these radical technologies are being told?
Oh man, that's such a good question, because when you talk about the confusion that arises around something like the blockchain, I want to modify that. I want to call that motivated confusion. It is a perplexity or an opacity that serves a specific set of interests. And the set of interests, are those of the people that develop the blockchain and are enthusiastic for it because it enacts the sets of values that that they believe in and they want to see instantiated in the world. And those values are not necessarily the ones that are represented to us as being what gets enacted when we install something like the blockchain in our lives. But what happens further, and what I find most frustrating, is that it seems like the mainstream media, if I can use that expression, wide sectors of the media have kind of a general positive orientation toward what they regard as the future. And there's something really insidious that happens anytime you see the BBC or the New York Times or even, the Guardian, the paper that I occasionally write for, talk about the future. There's this profound tendency to collapse the future with technological development, right? These two ideas, these two entirely separate ideas get elided. And so when people say, well, what kind of future do you want to live in? Well, most often we're no longer talking about, do you believe in a future of social equity? Do you believe in a future of expanded human potential or trans or post-human potential? No, you're asking, well, do you want to live in a future where our groceries get delivered to us by drones and, we pay for things at the checkout counter by using facial scans or something like that? And so the very first thing that we need to do is decouple these things from one another and ask of the media representations that we encounter, when we talk about the future, are we legitimately talking about a space of possibility, or are we merely talking about potentials for technological development? And the second thing that happens is that when you do see reportage about potentials for technological development, they are the most extraordinarily non-critical, non-skeptical, credulous, kind of gee whiz sort of tenor to them. And, even something, I grew up in the States, right? And so I grew up thinking that maybe the BBC was in some sense a deeper or more reliable media source than the ones that I was familiar with. When you look at reportage about the future on the BBC, it's like, Hyperloop enters testing phase, and they're talking about who's won Elon Musk's competition to develop a pod for the Hyperloop system. For those of your listeners who don't know about it, is an ostensible transportation system of the future that would operate subway cars in vacuum tubes, in evacuated tubes beneath the surface, or possibly even mounted on monorail pylons, and whip people from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 45 minutes or something like that. So many assumptions get folded into that that are never unpacked in the space of a 30-second segment or a 60-second segment, or even, regrettably, a 30-minute segment on that. First is, why is the BBC reporting on something that, in essence, is giving free advertising to Elon Musk's private concerns, right? They're advertising a developmental milestone that was achieved by a private commercial enterprise. That's the first thing that I would take pains to point out. The second thing is, what kinds of claims are being made for that technological development, and do they have any point of contact at all with reality? And from there, you're like, well, why are we focusing money and time and effort and energy on potentially trying to develop a future transportation technology when the social, political, economic questions about the technologies we already have are completely unresolved? And in fact, we might be able to make more of a positive change, through legislation, through something requiring carpooling, or that more people share vehicles, or that internal combustion engines be phased out earlier than the year 2040 or something like that. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, it's just remarkable how much the magic bullet is still with us. I mean, again, I sort of came of age thinking about these things starting in the late 80s and through the 90s, where there was, much more explicit utopianism, certainly about the internet and the long boom, and all sorts of
Yeah.
fantasies were very close to the surface. To my credit, I was enough of a pessimist that I was more interested in the evolving mythology than in actually believing that these things were going to happen. I was always kind of a critical crank. But what I thought was going to happen is when those things didn't happen, when the new economy did not become the new economy, when a lot of people lost their jobs, when all the not to mention later shocks in the market, et cetera, as we entered the new century, that the magic bullet thing would kind of go away. You couldn't really get away with it anymore. You had to make a more practical kind of argument from it. But in a weird way, it's like a kind of zombie. It keeps showing up. There's a new technology, and then the zombie of magic bullet is sort of smart grinning and pointing out the possible futures, and we just kind of go along with it as if, and you make this point towards the end of the book, as if potential is the equivalent still of fact, of reality, like the potential of whatever, digital fabrication, 3D printers to outrun scarcity and create this sort of world of abundance of distributed information. Yeah, on some level, yes, that potential is there. But then the way that we actually think about or experience these possibilities, it's like we just want to go towards that magic bullet story because is it just too difficult to think otherwise? Is it because we've been hoodwinked? Is it because there isn't a tradition of sort of technology criticism the way there is about other social formations, about academics or doctors or the medical profession? I mean, there's other things where there's more of a sense of cynicism even, or skepticism in popular discourse, but somehow it just never really happened around these things that are, if anything, more revolutionary and already more disturbing and disappointing in some ways than things like the medical industry or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean,
so what happened? How did that happen? How do we change it? With that, just to get the criticality going, let alone deal with the actual problems, just to get that kind of sense of I'm holding this device in my hand. The people who designed it want me to feel a certain way about it. They also want to do a lot of things that they're not telling me about. It's tied into labor practices in China. It's tied into the logics of cloud computing, of privacy issues. Like all those things are bundled in this stupid little, bit of sci-fi that I otherwise don't really think about and just use in this kind of casual manner. How do we bring those kind of things together to create a kind of critical technological engagement?
I think the first thing that we need to be aware of is a process that I've become acutely aware of myself in the last decade, which I think of as, desire and denial are both very, very powerful things. And I think when the desire for something is thwarted and, the denial begins to take over from that, what you see, instead of a reckoning with the reality principle, instead of a reckoning with the kind of material ground plane, what you see instead is a kind of doubling down. And we've seen this, politically, socially. And I think we see it in the realm of our encounter with new technologies as well. We always expect the next gadget to fix things for us, right? And so, we bring the smartphone into our lives, and it does all of these wonderful things for us. And I here I'm not being cynical. I mean, I think the smartphone in many ways is a legitimately utopian artifact, but it also creates problems. It creates problems through the way it compels us to mediate experience, and it just creates practical problems for us. And so this creates a market opportunity, right? And so all of a sudden we have the Apple Watch to mediate some of the issues that the Apple iPhone creates. And I think there's a lot of pressure on a product like that to serve as a buffer for some of the less pleasant aspects of interaction with everyday life that are set up from the technology immediately before it. And there's this sort of continual ratcheting where we think, okay, life, that the pace of life just keeps accelerating, and I keep feeling more and more overwhelmed, and I'm going to have a virtual assistant that is going to take care of my calendar and keep me from making these same mistakes, and keep me from being late for appointments, and keep me from double booking myself, and every other means that we use to repair the damage that we've done to ourselves through embracing the previous generation of technology. And yet we never step outside of this cycle far enough to realize how it's operating on us. Most of us don't. And so, to your question, yes, absolutely. I think that one of the things I've tried to do is to read technology like a text, and then expose it to the same sort of critique that, I grew up reading things like Dick Hebdige, like, Subculture, The Meaning of Style, or the texts that he pointed me at in turn, Raymond Williams' Cultural Studies, or Roland Barthes, people who are capable of looking at anything from a newspaper advertisement to a car to the cut of a suit as a text, and beginning to ask, what sorts of meanings this material semiotic knot sets up in culture, how it's used, what it implies, and what sorts of relations it makes available on the one hand, and what sorts of relations it makes less likely on the other. I think we need to be asking precisely that set of questions around network digital information technologies, and that requires a kind of literacy. And what I find is that most of us are scared to death of developing that literacy. In direct contrast to the opening up and the excitement that people display when you begin to talk about some of the frustrations and the melancholy that rolls off of technology, when you begin to talk about how things work, their eyes glaze over. And they say, this is for other people. This is for the techies and the geeks. And this is for people who are really into that. And the moment we do that, we see this entire terrain, which I would argue is the commanding heights of the contemporary political economy. We see this entire terrain to the people who are able to exploit it toward their own end, highly qualified to do so, highly equipped to do so, and to do so in a way that leaves us cut entirely out of the decision loop. So I think we need to demystify and kind of actively disenchant this ability that just invoking the idea of futuristic technology, this hold that the idea of futuristic technology has over our minds.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other dimensions of that is the fact that as these these radical technologies are becoming more radical, and as we're looking at, for example, how do we interpret, embrace, accept, resist the claims of artificial intelligence or the claims of machine learning as they spread extremely rapidly through power, through the idea of jobs, through the idea of expertise, through the very practice of making decisions. As all that happens, our enchanted ideas actually feed into the situation. It's not simply that we lack the critical capacity to understand enough about how these things work to be able to critically attack certain principles when we see people, trying to shove it down our throats. But it's the flip side, which is that we're already ready with the fantasy of robots. We're already ready with the fantasy of post-human intelligence that is making decisions. And so when somebody is trying to sell their system as being artificially intelligent, before we even get to the determination of whether it's actually intelligent, whatever that means, whether it's the Turing test or something else, blah, 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 before we even get to that phase, we're in this realm of hype, of companies putting forward claims that they can't really back up. And there's a corresponding resonance in our heads that is willing to go with that story. And one of the great examples of this that you provide is Tesla's decision to name a certain component of their onboard operating system autopilot.
Yeah.
And so could you talk about that example? Because it really gets to that crossover of fantasy and hype and the actual technological issues involved.
Yeah. This is a really crystal clear example of this process for me. So Tesla cars, extraordinarily well equipped with sensors and actuators. They're constantly siphoning up data about the environment that they're being operated in, and they're making thousands of minute decisions a second based on that data, and they're sharing it, mind you, with the mothership in essence, through the cloud with all the other Tesla cars that are on the road. So every Tesla car is constantly learning about what it is to be a car, what it is to be operated in the manifold of physical environments, legal environments, and psychophysiological capacities of the human driver. It's kind of constantly learning what all of that implies to the act of operating a vehicle. And Tesla itself is, through market pressure and the pressure to differentiate and evolve and be seen as being futuristic, is constantly trying to provide their cars with new capabilities. And one of their new capabilities is something they launched as part of their operating system 7 rollout a couple of years ago. And it was called Autopilot. And, to most people, that implies that the car can autonomously operate itself. I think that is a pretty clear implication of the nomenclature. Actually, what Autopilot is a very sophisticated and very capable station keeping algorithm. It's a lane keeping algorithm. It's sort of an auto-correcting feature, so that, if you're on a highway in a lane and you're driving, you're operating the vehicle, and you begin to stray out of that lane, the autonomous environment recognition sensors on board the vehicle will help redirect you, right? They'll take control of the vehicle and they'll return you to safe operation in a lane. That's what Autopilot is. That's what Autopilot does. Now, if I were running Tesla, and obviously I'm not a billionaire and I'm probably a little bit too honest for my own good, sure, I might have offered that feature, but I never would have called it what Tesla called it. I would have called it Autolane. But Autolane just isn't sexy enough for the market. They've got to, reach beyond that. They've got to aspire. And in calling it Autopilot, I think that they imply something fairly dangerous, which is that you can surrender control of the vehicle entirely. You can go off duty. You can relax your vigilance. You can watch a video on your iPad as your Tesla is cruising down the interstate at 90 miles an hour. And as it happens, last July, one of the first drivers who was equipped with Autopilot took that proposition at its word. He's like, okay, I'm going to, let my attention drift. And the Tesla that he was operating encountered a set of circumstances that it didn't recognize. I'm not going to go into the particulars, but suffice to say that he probably could have recovered operation of the vehicle safely at that moment if he had been paying attention. But he wasn't. And Autopilot steered him straight into the side of a semi. And it was a fatality collision. The driver was killed by this collision. And I would argue to you, and I personally believe, that the reason that driver is no longer among us is because he had invested entirely too much faith in the proposition that's being made by a word, by an idea. And as I say in the book, our beliefs about the future exert a very strange kind of gravitation over the present. In a lot of ways, it doesn't even matter whether these systems ever do work as advertised. It's that we believe that they do, as the driver of the Tesla found out to his ultimate detriment. But this belief operates in a couple of different dimensions as well. Obviously, this belief is the kind of thing that conditions societal investments, material investments, the sorts of allocations of finance we make when we decide, maybe some municipality somewhere can be persuaded to invest their limited degree of financial resources in developing a hyperloop network instead of maintaining the streets that they have, or instead of putting effort into understanding the actual flows of traffic in their community and crafting legislation and regulation that might address the circumstances. Belief about the future folds the present toward it. And sometimes this has what I would still regard as kind of powerfully beautiful effects. When John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address says, we do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. We're going to put a human being on the moon by the end of this decade. That is a belief about the future that catalyzes extraordinary, not merely material investments, but psychic investments. And lo and behold, it was made to happen. And if you regard that, as part of me continues to regard it as sort of a benchmark accomplishment of the upper limit of human aspiration, there's something really profoundly beautiful about that. But most of our beliefs about the future right now, as I've said, are tawdrier ones. And they're mostly about things that our machines will be able to do for us. And when these beliefs are enacted by large-scale institutions like corporations and states, we have a limited amount of ability to affect that. And I guess that's, to me, it's the weakest aspect of my book, which is that in some way it's still indulging itself in a liberal choice paradigm. It's still saying, well, if only we understood these things better, we could make better choices about them. And we are not always structurally empowered to do so. As a matter of fact, part of my belief is that we're decreasingly able to do so. And that is an unresolved tension in the book, and frankly, in my thought beyond the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tension in our experience. I mean, just using the example of the Tesla driver, for me, part of the charge of that as an allegory is just that moment of decision to sort of take your attention off of the task, and the trust that involves, but also the kind of way that that trust is manifested on a particular act of attention or a particular kind of tacit belief about what's going on. And I say that because I think one of the things that we can already see happening on just a sort of general life level, everyday level, is that, as you explain in another chapter in the book, as algorithms and machine learning and the interaction of these of different systems make more and more decisions for us, or in our place, that there becomes this question of, like, where do we locate agency? Where do we locate who's responsible for that? And I've noticed over the last couple of years where I, like everybody else, get involved in these kind of nightmarish phone tree call center problems about my credit card or my airline or whatever it is. We all have these things happen, relatively frequently. But I've noticed a weird shift, and it's partly something that I've done. Well, I'm in the conversation with the person, and we both start kind of talking about the system or the computer, or it's not letting me do that, or there's this kind of weird shift where it's not just about, no, you can do that or you can't do that, or this is what's going on. And sometimes it's like clear that nobody really knows, the credit card company, not just the person working at the call center, but the manager does not know why the algorithms decided to freeze that particular charge. That's right. So we get into this weird place where, as human beings, as people who grew up as a species that emerged in an environment where we're inside of a sometimes hostile, sometimes confusing environment that has sort of agency, and so we develop stories about patterns in nature, or about gods, or about the forces that are animating the jungle, or whatever the thing is. Like, this is sort of how we work. And now we're facing these new forms of intelligence, or at least decision making, that we don't really have any map for. So we're just kind of erratically grabbing at Disney movies and science fiction and technological fantasies or myths that have been promulgated by the technology industry about trusting them and reason and how rationality, but of course it's not really about reason or rationality, because we don't understand what these things are, why they're coming to the decisions that they are. So could you talk a little bit about that weird kind of not knowing that is beginning to spread in our experience? Yeah.
And remind me that I want to talk about this, because I think there's something particularly pernicious for progressive people and people who like to think of themselves as the left in this. So in order to understand this, we need to know a little bit about the way in which machine learning and neural networks specifically come together to constitute what's now thought of as artificial intelligence. A neural network is a structure, a computational structure that attempts to mimic the way in which nerve cells operate within the brain, and particularly to integrate perceptual experience and to derive understandings of the world from the raw sensory information that comes in through our afferent nerve cells. So there's layers to a neural network. The first node of a neural network may be connected to a camera, and it may simply say, am I looking at a white pixel or a black pixel? Am I looking at two black pixels together? And then each successive layer of the neural network is designed to recognize higher and higher order features of an image. If in fact the neural network that we're talking about is dedicated to computer vision or image recognition. And at the very bottom, way down, underneath 17 or 20 or 700 layers of integration and pattern recognition is some kind of gestalt, like that is an individual's face, and this is the named individual that is in the field of vision of this CCTV camera or whatever. The trouble is that there's no way to reconstruct from outside that system exactly what quality or attribute ultimately tripped that recognition, particularly in something that's called a convolved neural network, in which there's sort of recursive loops back into the various layers of the neural network. And this metaphorically and actually more and more literally is how machine learning systems arrive at their complex determinations of things. So they will integrate information across all of your available financial history when trying to make a decision about whether or not they're going to authorize an individual charge to your card. And these points of data might be things like, have you filled out an application in block capitals, or have you, mixed in lowercase letters, or, have you, tried to do it in script? Things that you don't necessarily think of as having behavioral implications or implications about your reliability or credibility. But it turns out that when you do a trawl through a population scale database, that these things have correlations with behavior that the credit issuer regards as undesirable or unworthy of extension of credit. And these things get bound together in the neural network's operation to the point that it is able to arrive at a determination that, hey, you charge something that ends in an odd digit on a Thursday, and that is just a bad pattern, and we're going to refuse you credit on that basis. But no human being has access to this. And as a matter of fact, there's no way to crack open the algorithm and find out what produced that weighting. Frank Pasquale calls this the black box operation. It's just lost to potential review or inspection, which is what results in things like you talking to the call center worker and even maybe escalating the case, to their supervisor, and nobody can figure out exactly why you've had the experience you have. Hopefully they have some kind of escalation procedure that will help you recover from it, but they can't reach into the black box. They can't make it account for itself. They can't make it speak. And there really is nothing that I would regard as the potential for algorithmic accountability. And this here is the problem that confronts the children of the progressive movement, right, who believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant and that transparency is our ultimate bulwark against bad government and corruption. When decisions are made by convolved neural networks, there's this beautiful pilot regulation that's before the EU that is a series of standards for algorithmic accountability. And it's, developed by extremely bright people who I would imagine have a great deal of technological understanding and yet have somehow missed the central implication of all this, which is that there's no way of asking for algorithmic accountability. These decision functions have absconded from our ken. They are making trans-rational decisions that, their main justification is that, quote unquote, they work, right? That the algorithmic black box can reliably identify bad credit risks, or it can reliably identify people who are likely to be recidivists and to be back in prison after being released. The sole justification that's ever offered for these things really is that they work. And the deepest irony there is that very often they don't actually work. Here is another instance in which the broad belief that these things are actually not merely effective, but more effective than the protocols and procedures that our societies relied upon before, helps spread something which I think actively sorts of paints us out of the picture. And I think that is wildly problematic. And as yet, very few people with a progressive political background or coming from what I would regard as the left have any way of approaching this that makes any sense to me at all.
Yeah, you said it. It's also just, it's such an irony, whatever, 500 years of science in the modern sense, of rationality's march through the barbarism of history, the emergence of the parliamentary form, of decision making, of empirical study, of high theory, and we get to this point where the most advanced marvel of the age actively undermines our capacity not only to give an account of its decisions, but even to understand more about the world. I mean, those correlations are bizarre, and yet they may work, but they don't. It's not because you can understand why writing in capital letters means that you're less likely to do it. You can't figure that out either. Anyway, unfortunately the clock on the wall is going to leave us with this can of worms completely open. The worms are everywhere, scuttling about. And all I can do is I once again encourage people to check out your book, Radical Technologies. Keep up with your stuff. You also have a website, Speedbird, and I hope to see you when you come through down here in October. You'll be doing some events over the next month or so, so people should check those out as well.
Thanks a lot, Erik. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thanks for being here, man. Until next week, folks, keep your minds open.